On April 30th, 8 days before the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history, Adolf Hitler died. The dictator spent his final days in a bunker, surrounded by his closest associates, the Goebbels family and Eva Braun. But why did this happen? Why did a man who was hated across virtually all of Europe never fall victim to an assassination attempt by political opponents or the population of the occupied countries? Were there really no such attempts? In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. During the 12 years of rule by the Nazi Party and Hitler himself, approximately 40 attempts were made on his life. The Führer himself claimed that he was protected by a mystical force he called Providence. However, it is worth considering why, in reality, none of these attacks were successful, and was he truly protected by God himself? On November 8, 1939, Hitler was scheduled to give a speech in one of the beer halls in Munich. However, no one yet knew that an unassuming craftsman, Georg Elser, was planning to end the life of the Führer in that very place. Elser was a carpenter who sympathized with communism, although he was not a member of any political party. He did, however, notice that under Hitler's rule, the quality of life in Germany had significantly declined and that the country was heading toward war. For over a year, he prepared his plan. In order to obtain materials for the bomb, he quit his job and took employment in a local quarry, where he secretly stole dynamite. He then spent about a month hiding in the beer hall where Hitler was supposed to speak, carving a small cavity into one of the columns near the podium, where he placed the explosive device. Finally, the day of the assassination attempt arrived. The Führer came to the capital of Bavaria. He originally planned to finish his speech around 10 p.m., so Elser set the detonator for 9:20 p.m. However, that night, the weather turned out to be unusually poor. The sky was heavily overcast. As a result, Hitler, instead of returning by plane as planned, was forced to travel by train. He left the venue at 9:07 p.m., just 13 minutes before the explosion. The bomb detonated as scheduled at 9:20 p.m., causing a massive blast in which 8 people were killed. Hitler, however, was unharmed. Elser, who had planned to escape to Switzerland afterward, was arrested by border guards. In his bag, authorities found a map of the beer hall and a trade union badge. He was arrested and later imprisoned in German concentration camps for years, where he ultimately died in 1945. However, this was not the only situation in which what seemed like a miracle saved Hitler's life. Shortly after the occupation of Warsaw, the local population decided to take advantage of the planned triumphal parade of the Führer and carry out a bombing attempt. The Polish resistance managed to gather around 500 kilograms of TNT. The explosives were placed under the supervision of German forces, under the pretext of repairing damaged water pipes. The detonator was electrical, and the wires were run to the basement of a nearby partially destroyed tenement building, where resistance fighters were stationed at the trigger point. October 5th arrived, the day of Hitler's procession. The conspirators were to rely on an observer who would give the signal at the right moment. And then something unexplained happened. There is no single clear account of what happened to the liaison. However, there are 3 main versions of events. According to the first, the Germans, prioritizing security, removed all civilians from the area at the last moment, and the liaison was chased away by a patrol and never reached the observation point. The second version states that the operation was canceled by the command itself, which feared reprisals and mass executions of civilians in the event of a failed assassination attempt. The most likely version suggests that Hitler's car was supposed to drive on the other side of the road, slightly farther from the planned blast zone, which may have caused the attacker to hesitate, believing the explosion would not be strong enough to guarantee success. In any case, the attempt failed once again, and Hitler left the scene unharmed. While the earlier attempts may have seemed somewhat amateurish and improvised, the next one already had all the conditions needed to succeed. Everything took place after the defeat at Stalingrad. The battle significantly weakened the southern front of the army, leading to growing unrest in Berlin. More and more people realized that the war was essentially lost. Among them was Henning von Treschow, the mastermind of the conspiracy within the Wehrmacht. Treschow knew that directly shooting Hitler was nearly impossible due to SS protection. He therefore decided to eliminate him in the air. The bomb was constructed using British explosives. The charge was shaped to resemble 2 bottles of Cointreau liqueur. The whole device was wrapped in paper, creating an inconspicuous-looking package. A chemical pencil detonator was used, which, after crushing an internal ampule, provided about a 30-minute delay before detonation. Hitler arrived at a military staff meeting on the Eastern Front. After lunch, he went to his Focke-Wulf aircraft in order to return to the Wolf's lair. Tresckow handed the package with the brandy bottles to Heinz Brandt, a member of Hitler's entourage. When Brandt boarded the plane, Tresckow signaled his adjutant, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, to activate the device. Hitler's plane took off at 13:15. Tresckow and Schlabrendorf returned to their office. The flight to the Wolf's lair lasted about 2 hours, so the explosion was expected to occur mid-flight. However, after some time, a message arrived that the plane had landed safely. The bomb had not detonated. The conspirators panicked. The device could explode at any moment, potentially killing innocent people. Schlabrendorf then went to Brandt and replaced the package under the pretext of a mistaken delivery. Later, in the sleeping compartment of a train, he locked himself in and with trembling hands opened the parcel with a razor blade. It turned out that the bomb had failed to detonate, most likely due to the low temperature at high altitude, which prevented the detonator from functioning properly. This was one of the first serious internal assassination attempts on Hitler, and in the coming months there were to be many more. The next opportunity arose just 10 days later. On March 21, 1943, Hitler was scheduled to visit the Arsenal building, Zughaus, in Berlin to inspect an exhibition of military equipment captured from the Soviets, held in honor of Heroes Memorial Day. Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf was an intelligence officer in Army Group Center. As a witness to war crimes on the Eastern Front and mass executions carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, he came to believe that the only way to restore Germany's honor and end the war was the physical elimination of Hitler. Gersdorf was assigned as the Führer's guide. For about 30 minutes, he was supposed to escort him through the exhibition and explain the achievements of the German war machine. This provided a perfect opportunity to carry out the assassination. The officer was equipped with 2 British-made explosive charges. Each had a 10-minute fuse. The plan was that, as the time ran out, Gersdorf would throw himself onto the dictator and die together with him in the explosion. However, once again, Hitler's instinct seemed to come into play. Instead of the planned 30 minutes, the Führer rushed through the exhibition in just a few minutes, barely paying attention to Gersdorf's explanations. Before the fuses could run down, Hitler left the building and got into his car. Gersdorf was left with 2 activated bombs in his pockets. He immediately rushed to the restroom, claiming stomach problems. According to his own account, he managed to defuse the explosives just seconds before they were due to detonate. The would-be assassin was not discovered and later took part in preparations for the most famous plot against Hitler, Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie was the most complex and advanced conspiracy against Adolf Hitler, combining a precise assassination attempt with a plan for a full-scale military coup at the very heart of the Third Reich. In the summer of 1944, as Germany's defeat on both fronts became inevitable, a group of high-ranking officers and civilian opposition members made a desperate attempt to save the country from total destruction. A key element of the plan was the use of official state procedures, codenamed Valkyrie, which had originally been designed in case of a revolt by forced laborers or internal unrest. The conspirators, having access to the chain of command, quietly modified these orders so that after Hitler's death, the reserve army would not defend the regime, but instead seize control of Berlin, arrest loyal Nazis and SS units, and enable the formation of a new government capable of negotiating peace with the Allies. The central figure of the events of July 20th, 1944, was Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, who, despite severe disabilities from wounds sustained in Africa, took on the role of the direct assassin. As Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, he was summoned to a briefing at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair near Kentregen. In his briefcase, he smuggled 2 explosive devices. However, due to time pressure and his physical limitations, he managed to arm only one of them. During the meeting, which, due to the heat, was held in a wooden barrack instead of a reinforced concrete bunker, Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the conference table, close to Hitler's legs, and then left the room under the pretext of an urgent phone call. A few minutes after his departure, a powerful explosion shook the headquarters. Observing the smoke and destruction from a distance, Stauffenberg flew back to Berlin, fully convinced that the dictator was dead. In reality, Hitler survived the blast, suffering only minor injuries, thanks to a series of almost unbelievable coincidences. One of the officers, trying to get a better view of the maps, moved the briefcase with his foot behind a massive oak table support, which shielded Hitler from the direct force of the explosion. Additionally, the fact that the meeting took place in a light wooden structure allowed the blast wave to escape through the windows instead of being contained and intensified in an enclosed space. While Stauffenberg spent 3 hours in the air, a state of paralysis took hold in Berlin. Loyalists at the Wolf's Lair managed to maintain partial communications and began broadcasting messages that the Führer had survived. By the time Stauffenberg arrived at the Bendler block and forced the activation of Operation Valkyrie, it was already too late to achieve the element of surprise. The final collapse of the coup came in the evening, when Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels managed to connect by phone the commander of the unit sent to arrest him with Hitler himself. Hearing the voice of the living dictator broke the will of most of the soldiers, who began switching sides back to the regime. Before midnight, the conspirators' headquarters had been secured, and General Friedrich Fromm, attempting to save himself and erase evidence of his involvement, ordered the immediate execution of Stauffenberg and his closest associates in the courtyard of the Bendler block. The failure of Operation Valkyrie marked the end of any real internal resistance, giving Hitler another several months to lead Germany toward total ruin. While the dictator firmly believed that his survival was the work of Providence, history suggests a much more mundane explanation, a tragic combination of poor luck, technical failures, and the hesitation of those who stood against him. Ultimately, it was not a grand assassin's plot, but the inevitable collapse of his front lines and the approach of Allied forces that forced Hitler into the silence of his bunker. In the end, the mystical force he relied on did not save him from the judgment of history. It only delayed the inevitable at the cost of millions more lives.